It is good to be here with you. First of all, I want to begin by offering my thanks to Ross for inviting me, and Ross and Heather spent some time with Sue and I last night, and it was nice to get caught up with them. It was in 2006 that we met Heather in Guatemala, a little ways from here, a place slightly warmer than here. But it was around this time of year too, wasn't it? It was sometime. March, okay, almost. You've done many things to make me feel welcome already. You've provided me with the appropriate amount of snow so that I do not feel like I'm away from home in Riverview. You've given us an appropriate temperature so that it feels, again, like Riverview. And most significantly, when I walked in this morning, I started looking at your windows and realized that the same artist created the windows here as we have in stained glass windows in Riverview. Although I must say, I do appreciate the clear glass windows so that you can see what's going on in God's world as well as within here. The other thing that you've done for me, which is going to happen in the near term, is there is a potluck following this service. The food of my people. It's a tradition within the United Church, isn't it? That when we gather, we break bread, and that is a good thing. There are many things about this denomination that I appreciate. I need to extend my thanks to you on a more serious note, though. Because of your support of the Mission and Service Fund, you enabled myself as well as others to take part in the World Council of Churches Ecumenical Accompaniment Program in Palestine and Israel. That's an awfully long acronym. But currently there is a group. I was there around this time last year. One of the last things I did before I left was Sue and I were standing out in the driveway at about 10 o'clock. I had a noon-hour flight, and I was showing her once again how to start the snowblower. In all seriousness, it was a privilege to be in Bethlehem, along with 30 other people from around the globe, Christians who were there with the World Council of Churches pretty much continuously as human rights observers. It's the largest contingent of any NGO that is on the ground continuously observing human rights in this part of the world that we know so well. At least we think we know so well. And that sometimes it just seems so very complicated, and it seemed so very complicated to me before I went there. And as we think of it, the reality of that part of the world stretches back thousands of years. The city of Jericho was actually founded not as a city, but there's been a continuous population there for 9,000 years. 9,000 years. Moses showed up in the land sometime around the year 1500. That's debatable. It's just a number. Around the year 750, the leaders of the Jewish people were moved into exile. Around the year 30, Jesus was conducting his ministry. Around the year 72, which was a significant year for our Jewish brothers and sisters, the diaspora began. The temple was sacked. Many of the Jewish community fled from that land in fear. But not all. Many remained. As Christianity began to spread, many of them converted to Christianity. Friends who I have there have told me that they trace their roots back countless generations. They were the first Christians. They remind us of that. Around the year 600 was the beginning of the rise of Islam. Many people during that time converted from either Judaism or from Christianity into Islam. People have lived there continuously. The history is broad and expansive. We can get lost in it because we think we have to solve problems that are 3,000 years old. The problems in the Middle East are clearly, though, much more rooted in the Second World War. The world leaders came to the realization that something had to be done. 6 million of our Jewish brothers and sisters lost their lives. 6 million. Half of the population of the Jewish people. I don't know what that feels like. I don't think any of us can really fully understand and appreciate what that must have felt like to the people at that time. Most of the common folk like you and I didn't really know what happened with the Holocaust during that time. That came a little bit later on. But the leaders of the world, especially in the West, came to the conclusion that something had to happen. So in 1948, the State of Israel was established by the United Nations. Part of why I trace the history back to 9,000 years was to help us to realize that the people were on the land. The Holocaust occurred. The nation of Israel was established. And in establishing the nation of Israel in 1948, the Jewish people had a new homeland, an old homeland. But they hadn't been there for 2,000 years. Almost 2,000 years. What happened in the war that broke out, because the Arab population, the Palestinians, were not about to give up their property. If somebody walked up to you after the service and said, "These people over here, they've been wronged. We want you to give up your home. We want you to move out." I don't think any of us, I know myself at least, would be ready to do that. Nor were the Palestinians. 500,000 Palestinians fled from that land. Yes, they fled as the Jews did in the year 72, in fear. Why is the United Church concerned with such a major problem? Before I went, this was a preoccupation with me. It's been a preoccupation since then. And really, there are 3 reasons, I think, why we're there, why we're involved. First and foremost, part of the reality is our sacred stories are rooted in that land. Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, Jerusalem, where Jesus died, are both in occupied Palestinian territory. Our sacred stories, as well as the sacred stories of our Jewish brothers and sisters, as well as our Islamic brothers and sisters, are truly rooted in that land. After 60 years, the Palestinian Christian community has invited us, other Christians around the world, to come and see what they are having to face as a result of the occupation that was begun in 1967. To come to better understand what it is like to be a living stone there. Not part of the monuments, but to be a real human being, a person of faith, a person with a family, a person with a history who lives there. We as people of faith in the United Church are truly rooted in that passage that we heard from Micah. If there are 2 things that define us as a denomination, one is inclusivity. We try to welcome brothers and sisters no matter what their background, no matter how young or old, no matter what race or what ethnicity, no matter what sexual orientation, no matter what. We try to welcome all. Beyond that, we are not a sacramental denomination. We are not a denomination that falls into a particular holiness code. We are a denomination that is rooted in what it is that we have heard from Micah today. What the Lord requires of us is to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. That is why we are there. That's some of the history. I want to give you a couple of different pictures. One of the ways that we understand the situation is by looking at maps to locate it. It's a tough neighborhood. I'll give it that. The Middle East is not a very stable place. If you look to the north immediately, you see Lebanon. A little bit to the northeast is Syria. We all know the problems that exist in Syria. To the west is Jordan, and more to the south is Egypt. Tough land, tough neighborhood. There's no denying that. A lot of conflict has occurred there. A lot of the world's focus is there. This map is quite well known amongst those who are advocating for a just peace for Palestinians and Israelis. It shows 4 different times in that particular land. The first map is taken prior to 1946. You folks can see it in green. Those folks way at the back in the more expensive seats in the background, because that's where people go in the United Church, as we all move to the back. The darker side of the screen. The dark side is where the Palestinians, where the Arab population was. The peace plan that was developed initially and that was advocated by the United Nations is the second map. So what the United Nations advocated, what they wanted to have happen in 1948. Palestinians didn't go quietly into the night. A war broke out. And what you see in the third frame is really what was in place until 1967. The small strip on my left-hand side, as I'm looking at it, is the Gaza Strip, one of the most densely populated regions in the world, 1.6 million in about 35 square kilometers, 350 square kilometers. Little more crowded than Halifax. Seeing that you are the largest city in Canada, you stretch from Yarmouth to Cape Breton. The other section is the West Bank. The last frame is really what we see today, a land that is fragmented. The areas that are white are the areas that are under Israeli control. The dark areas, the spotted areas, are under Palestinian control. We're people of the sea in this part of the world. A French sociologist developed this map a few years ago, showing what Palestine, what the West Bank would look like if this was a nautical map. It is very difficult to get around in Palestine because of checkpoints and roadblocks. In areas where I was in Bethlehem, where it used to take 5 minutes to drive from one village into the city of Bethlehem, it can now take an hour, sometimes longer. There are over 500 checkpoints. There are other things called flying checkpoints, spot checks. This data, where it says 522 checkpoints and 495 flying checkpoints, is data that comes from the United Nations. Palestinians do not have free movement. To go from one end of Palestine to the other can take 3 days. We would be a little bit outraged we would be more than a little bit annoyed if we were trying to move from Yarmouth through to Antigonish or Mulgrave, and it took us 3 days to get there. One death is one death too many. These are some statistics in terms of civilian casualties from the year 2000 to the year 2012. If you take it through 2013, now more than 7,000 Palestinians have lost their lives as a result of the conflict. Meanwhile, if you were to extend this to the end of 2013, 1,097 Israelis. 7-1, basically. The 12-year average, about 524 deaths amongst Palestinians, 84 Israelis. Still 600 too many. The current 5-year average, 475 Palestinians, but what's most significant is 13 Israelis. The reality is that with the end of the Second Intifada, which was about the year 2005, the number of Israeli deaths have dropped significantly. At the end of the Second Intifada, one thing continued on, though. Missiles going into Israel. We hear about them all the time. Friends, I can tell you that rifles are far more accurate than missiles. There have been 24 Israelis who have died as a result of missile attacks since 2005. There have been thousands of Palestinians who have been shot to death. One of the most shocking and grievous things, and I know you can't see these numbers. The screens aren't really large enough, is what goes on with children. The number of children who have died over the last 12 years, over 1,000 Palestinian children, about 40 Israeli children. So far, the yearly average of about 100, 108 in total. The 5-year average, it's still about 100 Palestinians. It's 99 instead of 101. And 8 Israelis. Sad commentary. The other part that is really disturbing for me, and you can't take annualized numbers in terms of people who are incarcerated in this part of the world, because it changes monthly. But according to Defense for Children International, there were 302 children who were in Israeli detention in March of 2013. 38 of those were under the age of 16. Part of the reality of the situation that I'll touch on, one last piece of information before we move to some more personal stories about people, is that when we say that something is illegal, it is illegal under something that most of us have heard of but haven't really read in detail, the Geneva Conventions, which govern our behavior as nations in times of conflict, including in times of occupation. The United Nations, the International Court of Justice have all ruled that the Israeli occupation of Palestine is illegal. Occupations are not meant to extend for many years, as they did not extend in Afghanistan or in Iraq. These are some stories from one particular day in my life. They're meant to give you glimpses of people and of some of the more personalized stories in terms of what goes on in the situation there. This was a bit of an exceptional day, but they're all people who I sort of know in one way or another. The day before had been a wonderful day. I'd been in Tel Aviv. I'd actually been at the Canadian Ambassador's residence for a reception. I lived with 3 vegetarians and a vegan. I'm a carnivore. I actually got to eat meat that night at the ambassador's residence. I was happy. I was coming home, and the next day I was supposed to work with a young Palestinian photographer and videographer. When I arrived back at our house at about 8:30, I had a phone call from the young man who's lying in the bed, Musa. The night before, there had been one of the regular incursions into Ida camp, a refugee camp, which was about 400 or 500 yards away from where we lived in Bethlehem. Musa was taking pictures of the incursion. He's a photographer. That's his job. An Israeli soldier told him to stop. He said, "I can't. This is my job." Or, "I won't. This is my job." He turned slightly. Another Israeli soldier from less than 30 feet away shot him in the face with a rubber bullet. Fortunately, it hit him right around here, just so you folks can see. It missed his eye, which for a photographer would be incredibly difficult. It didn't destroy his jaw, and it didn't hit him in the temple, which would have killed him. In a sense, he was lucky. Musa's in an interesting situation. Like many Palestinians, he has been charged with a crime for that night. There's photographic evidence, though. Palestinians who come before Israeli courts, there is a 99% conviction rate. You heard me right. A 99% conviction rate if you're charged. He may be part of the 1%. Two of my friends, two of my colleagues, while I was dealing with Musa, and obviously Musa and I weren't going to go off and do any work that day, and that was his mother who was tending to him that day, by the way. This is a picture of a young boy in a school in Tuku. His principal, Salah, is caring for him. The young boy, who was 12 years old, saw something shiny underneath a bush in the school ground. There are regular clashes between young Palestinians and Israeli military. He saw this shiny thing under a bush. He's a 12-year-old kid. What's he do? He reaches under and takes it out. It was an unexploded tear gas container that went off here. Fortunately, the flames didn't get him. He must have been holding it like that because they flame out to release the gas. He got tear gas significantly. He was taken to hospital shortly after that. I don't know what the long-term effects on a 12-year-old's lungs are who would get hit by tear gas like that. I'm sure they would not be good. Later that day, we got a phone call from some of our friends, actually from the mayor of not the village, not the town that you're seeing. This is Batir Alat. But from the mayor of one of the neighboring villages, the two neighboring villages. One is called Wadi Fukin, the other one is Nahalin. We had done a lot of work with the folks in Nahalin. And they had called us to go out and visit with them that day because they'd received 60 demolition orders over the previous couple of weeks from the Israeli government. Okay. One of the things that was going on, my slides are sort of out of sequence here, there. One of the things that was going on in Nahalin that they were experiencing was the people in the settlement of Batir Alat, which is a settlement of about 45,000 people. You see the upper circle, the yellow circle? That's actually a sewage pipe, an overflow pipe. You could understand if there was one accident. Two accidents in terms of the release of sewage that's going to flow downhill. Get a little bit more concerned about. It was being released on about a bi-weekly basis. Coming down, contaminating the fields, the orchards, killing the olive trees in the area, and contaminating the well water for the villagers in Nahalin. I know I'm drinking a lot of water. I get a little bit still tied into this, so excuse me for that. If your house, if you receive a demolition order, and this is actually what a demolition looks like. If you do not take down the house or the property yourself, bulldozers come in and take it down for you. This was a restaurant that was destroyed just before I left. And the cruelest part of this in some ways is you get the bill for the bulldozer. These are some of my friends. that was enough about that one day. It was not a good day. This is George. George is the landlord of the apartment that we lived in Bethlehem, about 100 yards away from the wall, from the gate. George is a Palestinian Christian. His last name is Landry. I was going to keep asking him if he was related to anybody in New Brunswick. George and his family had applied for a permit to go from the 6 miles from Bethlehem into Jerusalem so that they could go to the services on Easter weekend. Think of how significant that is for people to be able to go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He, his wife, his 2 daughters all applied for permits. His wife, his 2 daughters received permits. He didn't. All of the family stays home if one of the family can't go. You'll hear data in terms of the number of permits that are issued to Israeli or to Palestinians to allow them to attend religious services. What we're noticing, what there are accurate reports on, is that they're segregating families, so they don't go. George also, in the area that we lived on, had about 5 olive trees for he and his family. This is a picture of Har Homa, which is about, a mile or so away from the house where we lived. George's family used to have an olive orchard there with about 50 trees. It was a good source of income for he and his family. But they can no longer, of course, access them. This is a picture of my little brother and myself, Majdi, in his shop in Bethlehem. Majdi is actually younger than I am. He's been running a business there that used to be incredibly successful. As many of the shops were in Bethlehem that sold souvenirs. And then in the year 2002, something happened in Bethlehem. A wall was constructed. Tourists no longer go to Bethlehem. If they do, they go for a day. They don't go there and they don't stay. The wall is 26 feet high and higher in parts of Bethlehem. His business has dropped by 2/3. This is a picture of my friend Amin. Amin gets up at 2 o'clock every morning. Well, 5 mornings a week, actually. He is the Tim Hortons equivalent franchise for the gate, the checkpoint in Bethlehem, where 3,500 to 4,000, predominantly men, go through each day to get to work in Israel at low-paying manual labor jobs. When Amin was 17, he was throwing some rocks. Amin ended up spending a year in jail as a result of that. Amin is now in his mid-30s, 4 children. His youngest was born while we were there, Mustafa. Great name. Anyway, it's now easier, because he's been blacklisted, for Amin to go to Germany than it is to go to Jerusalem, 6 miles away. This is Rabbi Fanuf. We joined him one day in his olive orchard. This was a day when 85 olive trees were cut by people, again, from that same settlement, from Batir Elat. He's in the Nahalin area. Rabba was devastated. It was the first source of income for his family. They lost about 25,000 shekels a year as a result of that, and it's their first source of income for the family. They lost that in one night. Who did it? Like most things, they occur under the dark of night. It's impossible to prove that an ordinance is left in a schoolyard hidden under a bush. It's impossible to prove who's cutting olive trees. I honestly believe that most Israelis do not know what is going on in Palestine. That same night that I was at the ambassador's residence, one Israeli said to me, and this is amazing what he said. He said, I used to know what was going on in Bethlehem all the time, but it's like somebody built a wall. I'm a Canadian. I was too polite to tell him, you did. I believe most Israelis do not honestly know what is going on. This is a woman who does. This is a tiny little woman. She comes up to about here on me. Hannah Barak is her name. She's a Holocaust survivor. She describes herself as being one of the true patriots. She believes in what Israel was created to be, a light to the nations, a nation based on justice for all. She comes with others from Maxim Watch to the checkpoints to try to help out, to get the lines moving, because oftentimes the lines don't move. We know they can move, but they don't. One day, I wasn't there for this. One of my German colleague was there. Hannah Barak shows up, all of this tall, 80 years old. The head of the checkpoint 300 is one of the biggest checkpoints that the Israelis run. He walks out. He sees her. He goes 3 steps back, and then he bows. There are many who are working for peace and justice, for Israelis, for Palestinians alike. They believe in the promise that God offers to us, as does our denomination. We've begun a campaign called Unsettling Goods. We're trying to educate ourselves more about Palestine and Israel, the conflict that exists there, and about the people who live there. We're trying to do some things. We're encouraged to pray. We're encouraged to visit. And I see a couple of friends here who have visited there. We're encouraged to do much. One of the things that we're encouraged to do is to not purchase products that are produced in the West Bank, because they're produced in settlements which by definition under the Geneva Convention are illegal. Land that has been seized by Palestinians. 3 companies that we're targeting. One is called SodaStream. They've been in the news a lot lately because Scarlett Johansson did a wonderful ad for them during the Super Bowl. She was also in conflict with Oxfam, where she'd been a goodwill ambassador. Oxfam supports those who call settlements illegal. And so she had to resign from that position. She will encourage you to buy SodaStream products. I'll say, not so much. I'm not nearly as good looking as Scarlett Johansson. This is a company that puts out a lot of propaganda. They put out their side of the story. They employ a few hundred Palestinians. A few hundred. About 4. There are 4 million Palestinians in the West Bank who are suffering day to day as a result of the occupation. Another company is called Ahava. They make wonderful stuff, beauty treatment, beauty products. I've never used their products. It shows. We'd encourage you to boycott them as well as another company called Keter, which manufactures plastic goods, mainly gardening stuff. These are the companies that we can clearly identify as being on the West Bank. These are companies that people in the General Council offices have tried to work with to say, let's enter into dialogue. SodaStream invited one of our people to visit them. The person who invited them happened to not be there when she was there trying to arrange a visit. We would ask you, we've also targeted 4 major retailers. You can find out all of this information online. It's not just major retailers, it's smaller retailers. If you see somebody who's selling these products, ask them why they're selling them. We as Canadians believe in certain values. We believe in peace with justice. We believe in freedom. We believe in supporting human rights. The economic action that occurred in South Africa was what finally brought about a change there. Many other countries, especially in Europe, are far ahead of where Canada is in terms of talking about boycotts. We don't want you to boycott Israeli products. We don't want you to boycott the retailers. We want you to think about boycotting these products. And especially if they're prominently displayed, talk to the retailers. Don't just say, we're boycotting that. Try to engage them. Explain to them why. We want people to pray, choose, speak. That's what we're asking people of faith to do. That's what we're asking you to do. The time is now. The Palestinian Christians have called their document the Kairos document. A critical time. A time of making decisions, of making choices. We're asking people to choose a just peace for Palestine and Israel. We're asking you to pray, not just for Palestinians, but for Israelis as well. And yes, for people who are suffering all around the world. But there has been no other occupation that has gone on this long. That's part of why we're involved. We're also inviting people to visit. If any of you are interested in going, I'll be happy to introduce you to some people who might be going in the long term and putting together a tour. What does God require of us? To do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly. And yes, Matt, you can bring up the next slide, because it makes sense. To offer of ourselves, our spirits, our minds, our hearts. Thank you. Thank you from our brothers and sisters in Palestine and Israel who are working for a just and lasting peace. Thank you for the opportunity of being here. Thank you for your support of the United Church here in Lower Sackville, in Canada, and around the world.